$91,000. That is the cash pile that covers 2.5 years of the average 65 and over household's real spending gap. And it is about $60,000 smaller than the number that gets handed around as the retirement cash rule. Not because I am being reckless with your safety margin, because the number most people are quoting is measured in the wrong unit, and once you fix the unit, the pile shrinks to something you can actually build. This figure is going to move twice before we are done. And the second move is the one that matters. Here's the arithmetic that produces it. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts average annual spending for a household headed by someone 65 or older at $61,432. That is $5,119 a month going out the door. But roughly $2,084 of that arrives every single month from Social Security. And it arrives whether the market is at a record high or down by half. It does not care. It shows up on the same Wednesday either way. So the portfolio is not responsible for $5,119 a month. It is responsible for the difference, $3,035 a month, about $36,400 a year. That is the gap. Now, why does that distinction change the answer by $60,000? Because the job of a cash reserve in retirement is to replace portfolio withdrawals, not to replace your spending. Christine Benz built the bucket framework at Morningstar around exactly that wording. The first tier holds a couple of years of anticipated portfolio withdrawals, not a couple of years of living expenses. Those are different quantities for anyone receiving a benefit check. Somewhere in the retelling, withdrawals got translated into expenses, because expenses are the number people can say out loud without doing a subtraction first. Price 2.5 years in expenses, and you get about $154,000. Price the same 2.5 years in the gap, and you get $91,000. Same idea, same protection. One of them is fundable this year, and the other is the reason most people never fund it at all. Your number is almost certainly not $91,000, and you can find it with one subtraction and one multiplication. Take a couple spending closer to $84,000 a year, which is $7,000 a month, a real number for a household that still travels and still carries some housing cost. Though I want to be clear that $84,000 is an illustrative higher spending couple and not a bureau figure. Two benefit checks for an aged couple, both collecting average about $3,208 a month in 2026. Their gap is $3,792 a month. 30 months of that is about $114,000. So the honest band for most people watching this runs from roughly $90,000 to roughly $115,000. Not $200,000. Not 1 year of everything. Quick note before I keep going. I wrote a digital book called The Exit Code, and one of its sections is the dynamic withdrawal method, the rules for what your spending does after a bad year instead of pretending nothing happened. It runs on the same arithmetic we are doing right now. It is linked in the description if you want it. Back to the pile. 30 months is not a round number picked because it sounds reassuring, and the reason it is 30 is not the reason most people give. Hold that. First, I want to be exact about what this money is for. Because if you mislabel the job, you will size it wrong every time. This is not an emergency fund. Your emergency fund handles the transmission and the crown and the water heater, and it exists at every age. This is also not a market call. You are not holding cash because you think a decline is coming. You are holding it so that the question of whether a decline is coming stops being a question you need to answer. The reserve exists to make one specific action unnecessary for a defined stretch of months. That action is selling shares. And there is a serious published argument that everything I am about to describe is a rearranged version of the same portfolio you already own, which I will bring back later at full strength, rather than pretending it does not exist. Here is why selling is the thing worth engineering around. If your portfolio is down 50% and you need $3,000 this month, you do not sell $3,000 of loss. You sell $3,000 of shares, and at half price, that is twice as many shares as the same withdrawal cost you last year. Those shares are gone. They are not there when the rebound arrives, and the rebound is what a recovery actually is. The same shares repricing upward. A market decline is temporary. A sale during that decline is permanent. That is the whole mechanism. And it is why ride it out is decent advice for someone still working and incomplete advice for someone withdrawing. Also, if this kind of arithmetic is your idea of a good time, clicking subscribe helps a lot. So thanks to everyone who does. So take the Tuesday, same household, same gap of $3,035 a month, and the market opens down 50%. Two versions of that household, identical in every way except one. The first has no reserve. Month one, they sell shares to cover the gap, and because prices are halved, that withdrawal costs them roughly double the shares it would have cost at the peak. Nothing dramatic happens on screen. A statement arrives. The balance is smaller for two separate reasons now. The market took its share, and they took theirs. The second household funds the same month from the $91,000. $3,035 moves from a cash account to a checking account. The bills are paid. The grocery run happens. Nothing is sold. The share count on the statement in month one is identical to the share count in the month before the decline. That is the entire visible difference, and it looks like almost nothing. Run it 12 months. Both households have absorbed exactly the same percentage decline. I want that stated plainly because the reserve does not soften the drop, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. The market did to both portfolios precisely what it did. The difference is measured in a column most people never look at: shares owned. The first household has permanently fewer. The second has the same number it started with and a cash pile down to about $54,000. And there is a second pile I have not mentioned yet, sitting behind the cash, doing more work in this scenario than the cash is. Before that, the obvious objection: is a 50% decline a made-up scare number? It is the record, not the scare. The S&P 500 fell 48.2% from January of 1973 to October of 1974. It fell about 49% from 2000 to the bottom in October of 2002. And from October of 2007 to the 9th of March 2009, it fell 56.8%, closing that day at 676.53. 3 times in 50 years, the number in the title has been beaten. 50% is the conservative version of this test, which brings back the 30 months. The average bear market across the 27 of them, the S&P 500, has produced since 1928, runs 289 days. That is 9.5 months. 30 months of coverage does not sit close to that average. It sits at roughly 3 times it. That is the actual justification for 2.5 years, and it is not a comfort number. It is a number chosen to sit well in front of the typical distance from the top to the bottom, with room for the version that runs long. Now watch what happens if the version that runs long actually shows up. Month 12, the reserve is at 54,000. Month 24, it is around 18,000. Month 30, it is 0. The gap has been funded 30 times without a single share sold. And on that morning, the market can still be down. This is not a trick, and I am not walking anything back. It is arithmetic. You can verify with a calculator on your phone. 30 times 3,035 is 91,000 and change. And after the 30th withdrawal, there's nothing left in the account. So does the thing fail? Look at how long the recoveries actually took. From that March 2009 bottom, the index did not print a new record high until late March of 2013, 4 years. From the October 2002 bottom, it took until October 11th, 2007 to exceed the prior peak 5 years. 30 months does not span either of those. It does not come close, which means the promise I opened with is too generous, and I would rather downgrade it myself than have you discover it at month 31. A $91,000 reserve does not carry you through a crash. That is the second move in the number, and it is the important one. What changes is not the dollar figure, but what the figure is responsible for. Because you were never trying to outlast the recovery. You were trying to outlast the bottom. Go back to the mechanism. The damage from selling is not that you sold. It is the number of shares a fixed dollar withdrawal consumes at a given price. At the bottom, that number is at its maximum. 6 months later, with the index up 30% off the floor, the same $3,000 costs meaningfully fewer shares. Selling into month 18 of a recovery is expensive. Selling on the 9th of March, 2009 was irreversible. The reserve's job is to cover the stretch where those two things are furthest apart. And 30 months, sitting at 3 times the average bear length, covers the descent and a good piece of the climb. It was never supposed to hand you a new record high. It was supposed to hand you a floor you did not have to sell into. And behind it stands the pile I flagged. In Benz's architecture, the cash tier holds about 2 years of withdrawals, And the tier behind it holds the money you expect to convert to cash in years 3 through 10, 8 more years of the gap, in high quality bonds. Notice the unit never changes. Not percentages, not allocations, not fund names. Years of your gap, 2 in cash, 8 behind it, and everything past year 10 in equities, which is the only tier that has a 10-year runway to be volatile in. So the household at month 30 is not out of options. It is out of the first tier, and the second tier is where the next several years of gap were always going to come from. What that architecture does not yet contain is any instruction about when money is allowed to move between the tiers. Here's the part that never makes it into the retirement calculator. The calculator assumes you will do the correct thing at month 11 of a 56% decline. It has no field for that. Knowing the number and executing it while your statement is bleeding are 2 different skills, and only one of them is arithmetic. That gap is why I built the exit code. A digital book that takes 50 years of actual retirement data and turns it into a framework with dates and thresholds rather than encouragement. 2 pieces of it apply directly to what we are doing here, the 4% trap and the dynamic withdrawal method that replaces a fixed inflation-adjusted paycheck with rules for strong and weak markets, and the lazy portfolio, the boring allocation that has historically beaten active trading over 30-year windows without requiring you to have an opinion about anything. 8 chapters of research, no filler. You can get it for less than a dinner out through the link in the description. And every year you postpone building the reserve is a year the sequence risk sits unhedged. Now, the instruction that governs the tiers, the question I get more than any other, and it is the right question. At what percentage down do I stop selling shares and start spending the cash? 30%? 20? Everybody wants a level. The published answer is not a percentage. And once you see why, the percentage version starts to look broken. Say you set your trigger at 30%. That means from market high all the way down to minus 29, you are still selling shares. You are funding your gap through the entire descent at progressively worse prices right through the stretch where each dollar withdrawn costs the most shares. You switch to cash exactly once the worst of the damage has already been done. And depending on where the bottom actually falls, you may switch on at close to the least useful moment available. A level-based trigger has you selling hardest where selling hurts most and stopping where it hurts least. It is backwards. And it is backwards for a reason that has nothing to do with courage. The real rule was published in March of 2006 by Jonathan Guyton and Guyton-Klinger in the Journal of Financial Planning. And it is one sentence. No withdrawals are taken from any equity following a year with a negative return if cash or fixed income assets are sufficient to fund the required withdrawal. That is it. The trigger is not a level. It is a sign, the sign of last year's return. It is annual, not intraday, so it does not ask you to watch anything. Down year, you do not sell stock. Up year, you do. I know that a sign feels like a lesser answer than a percentage, and I felt the same thing the first time I read it. A percentage feels like control. A sign is something you can check once a year in January in about 4 minutes, which is why it is the one that gets followed. If cash or fixed income assets are sufficient to fund what? The required withdrawal, which is the gap you're spending minus what arrives, regardless of the market. The rule and the pile are not 2 ideas, they are one object. Guyton-Klinger's sentence is an instruction that only executes if somebody has already done the subtraction and pre-funded the answer. And the $91,000 is precisely the amount that makes the word sufficient evaluate to true for 30 consecutive months. Without the pile, the rule is a nice thought. Without the rule, the pile is money sitting there while you sell shares anyway because nobody told you this was the day, which leaves the part almost nobody executes, the refill. A reserve that is never rebuilt works exactly once. The other half of the same rule is that in years the market is up. Equity sales fund 2 things, the coming year's gap and the restoration of the cash tier back toward 30 months. That is a step people skip, and they skip it for a completely human reason. Refilling the reserve means selling shares in a good year, and selling in a good year feels like leaving money on the table. It feels like the opposite of what got you here. So the pile stays half full, and the next decline arrives with 14 months of coverage instead of 30, and the rule quietly stops evaluating to true. Let me say something about why the wrong version of this advice circulates so easily. Because it is not villainy, it is arithmetic on somebody else's side of the table. Cash held in a separate account is usually cash an advisor is not billing on. 1% of $91,000 is $910 a year. That is the priced cost of recommending it, and it recurs. That is not an accusation, and I do not think advisors are sitting around scheming about your money market account. Most of them are decent people working inside a fee structure they did not design and cannot individually change. The incentive does not need anyone to be dishonest. It only needs the topic to come up slightly less often than it otherwise would. I have spent more than 10 years running my own business, surrounded by accountants and fiscal lawyers who taught me how money actually moves. And the pattern I keep seeing is that the advice which survives is the advice that is comfortable for everyone in the room to say out loud. Now, the objection I promised, and I am going to state it at full strength, because a weak version would be worthless. Michael Kitzes has argued that the bucket approach is, mathematically, an asset allocation mirage. His 2016 analysis compared a 60-40 portfolio with annual rebalancing against a 3-bucket portfolio at the same overall allocation, both funding a 4% inflation-adjusted withdrawal across 30-year rolling historical periods. The terminal wealth distributions came out nearly identical. The buckets did not raise the safe withdrawal rate. They did not lower the failure rate. And Javier Estrada's work found that buckets run without rebalancing actually underperform a static allocation, because a rebalanced portfolio does something buckets do not. It buys equities while they are cheap. So the honest summary of the research is that the $91,000 is not a mathematical edge over a portfolio you rebalance properly. I'm going to concede that and then make the stronger claim. A rebalanced portfolio already funds your withdrawals from the assets that are up and never from the ones that are down the most, which means a well-run total return portfolio is doing the same thing. The cash tier does silently inside an allocation table. The math is close to a wash. What is not a wash is execution. Rebalancing in March of 2009 required a human being to sell bonds and buy equities on the worst week of their financial life, with the news on their own initiative, with no dollar figure telling them they were allowed to. A cash tier converts that same behavior into an instruction that is visible, named, dated, and spendable. The account has $91,000 in it. The return last year was negative, so this year's gap comes from here, and the shares are not touched. And Kitzes' objection carries its own instruction. Rather than canceling the plan, refill, and rebalance, do not let the tiers sit frozen, because the version that fails is the one nobody ever tops back up. An instruction you will actually execute beats an optimization you abandon in month 11, which is why the honest limit is worth stating. The Employee Benefit Research Institute's 2024 spending study found that 59% of retirees had 3 months of emergency savings, down from 69% in 2022, while 36% had already faced unexpected spending since retiring. 3 months is not 30. Most people reading about buckets are not deciding between 91,000 and 154,000. They are sitting somewhere near 9,000 and calling it handled. If this is the sort of arithmetic you want more of, subscribing genuinely helps the channel, and I appreciate everyone who does. And this is the point where your job description changes, which is the part that catches good savers off guard. The reflexes that built the portfolio were accumulation reflexes. Never sell, add on weakness, keep the balance climbing, treat cash as the enemy of compounding. Every one of those was correct for 30 years, and I would not change any of them. But the person who withdraws has a different role. You are no longer the investor optimizing the balance. You are the operator of a system, and the operator's only 2 duties are checking a sign in January and topping the reserve back up in the years that go well. Staying in the old role has a price, and the price is that in the 1 month the system was designed for, you will do what an accumulator does, protect the balance by selling whatever's easiest to sell, and the shares will be gone. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. And this is the laziest possible version of it. 2 decisions a year, both of them boring. So here is the operation, slowly enough to write down. Take your monthly spending. Subtract everything that arrives, whether or not the market cooperates. Social Security, a pension, rental income, a spouse's paycheck. Multiply what is left by 30. About $91,000 on the average 65 plus budget. About $114,000 for the higher spending couple. 3 conditions attached. It buys the bottom, not the recovery. Bonds stand behind it for years 3 through 10. And it must be refilled in the up years or it works exactly once. Then the Tuesday looks like this. The market opens down 50%. The bills get paid out of the reserve. Not one share is sold. And the thing that used to be an emergency turns out to be a transfer between 2 of your own accounts. An emergency turns out to be a transfer between 2 of your own accounts.